In this episode, you will discover the hidden tactics of coercive control and a powerful approach to navigating co-parenting with a toxic ex so you can protect yourself and your children.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life.
This week, we had Dr. Christine Cocchiola and Amy Polacko on the show, and we had a powerful conversation about their work in coercive control, some incredible stories of survivors, and the shocking reality of what women face in family law issues and in the family law court system. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Dr. Christine Marie Cocchiola and Amy Polacko join us for part 2 of Christine's episode to share some of the incredible stories from their book, Framed: Women in the Family Court Underworld. Amy is a freedom warrior dedicated to helping women live life on their own terms during and after a toxic relationship or divorce. Christine is a coercive control educator, researcher, and survivor. We'll be discussing their work, their book, and the urgent realities women face in the family court system. Welcome to the show, Christine and Amy.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, I'm very excited to have you both, and I love it. Sometimes I have 2 guests because it's just different than the regular where it's just one. So a lot of things to say. For our listeners, I would love it if you could each, Amy and Christine, share a little bit about yourself, your own story and divorce story, and really what drew you to this family law divorce space.
Sure. I'll defer to Amy. Go ahead.
Okay, Amy, go first.
So I call my coaching business Freedom Warrior for a reason. I've been married and divorced twice and learned a lot along the way. I say in our book that, I was a babe in the woods when I went into family court, and what I saw really shook me to my core. I could not believe it. It was like the Twilight Zone. And I thought that, women need to be educated and empowered, and knowledge is power, right, about this system. Mm-hmm. So I became a coach, the coach I never had myself. And I have a course for women called Divorce Decoded that really teaches them about family court and all these things they should know going into a divorce. I do one-on-one coaching. I have a support group. And my heart has really led me to this work. I feel so passionately about it because I made so many mistakes myself. And I always say to my clients, I want to make sure you don't make those mistakes. We're going to prepare you for the worst. We're going to work toward the best. And I think that's why we wrote this book. Is Christine and I work in this field every day. We are touched by the stories of women who are our clients, and we wanted the world to know what's really happening in this underworld. We want all women and men to read these cautionary tales, because the feedback we've gotten is people are blown away that this could actually be happening in the US and the UK and Australia and Canada and other places.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And Christine?
Yeah. So I began this work at the age of 19 and began advocating against child abuse and sexual assault and domestic violence, and became a volunteer for a local umbrella agency and was doing that work for 35 years. So I've been embedded in the field in child welfare and worked in public schools with children who have suffered abuse, all sorts of experiences of abuse, and became a therapist and an educator and teach on this subject every single semester, but did not know I was suffering the abuse, because what we know about coercive control is that it doesn't have to be physically violent, that oftentimes any abuse, frankly, any abuse never starts off as physically violent. Typically, it starts off with coercion and control. And so it's easy to miss the signs. And I hope that I am like a person for people to say, hey, if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. And, but I've always been very invested in the welfare of children. So, how do we help children growing up in these family systems who, your work, right, Heather, they're forced to actually be in the presence of an abuser. They may not want to go. They may acquiesce, they may align with that abuser. How do we as protective parents give them the skills they need to survive that? And how do protective parents find the skills to survive that? And frankly, how do we train clinicians and attorneys and coaches to truly understand what's going on within not only the intimate relationship, but the meso systems and then the macro systems, how we are impacted across the board in this. And those are the trainings that I provide and the education that I provide also.
Which is wonderful and so important. And it's, you're bringing light to something that we know has been going on forever, but needs light brought to it so that people understand, right? And knowledge is power. Now, your book, Framed, Women in the Family Court Underworld, starts off by talking about the divorce industrial complex. I would love one of you to weigh in on that and explain that to our listeners.
Sure. I think that's in Dr. Ramani's foreword that she wrote for us, and we are eternally indebted to her for doing that. I mean, this idea that there's a lot of money to be made in the process. And that there's a lot of harm that is inflicted as a result of that. And, you know, we don't want to make people listening be turned off by this idea that there's complicitness. But frankly, when there's money to be made by service providers in the system, I don't know what other word to call it besides complicitness, right? I mean, you know, I had a mom the other day, her child is 16 and the court system is requiring, the abuser wants her to have a custody evaluation because the 16-year-old is no longer wants to go with the father because the father has been physically violent. So it's all coercive control. But this kid has had that experience of watching their mother being harmed in front of them. And this child doesn't want to see the father anymore. And so the court system has allowed the father to require a custody evaluation on a 16-year-old who has seen all of these horrific experiences. Isn't that enough to say that that evaluator isn't necessary? Number one, she went to the evaluator. The evaluator made it clear to her. He never says no contact. He never gives that as a recommendation. Yet we have a 16-year-old who can verbalize what he has seen and felt in that home, and nobody cares about that experience. So the industrial divorce complex is truly this, it's an industry that makes lots and lots of money. And I just want to follow up really quickly, and I'm sure Amy has more to add, but you know, we called it Framed Women in the Family Court Underworld. And we have on here the abuser's playbook, because this is what abusers do, is they know how to navigate the system in a way where they get heard very frequently, even when a 16-year-old has a voice. And it's quite disheartening. So
Indeed.
So I would just add this sentence from Dr. Ramani's amazing foreword in our book, where she says, family court and the divorce and dissolution business are often easily gamed and weaponized by people driven by ego and entitlement, who believe the rules do not apply to them, who care more about winning, vindictiveness, power, and control than they care about the welfare, not only of someone they once claimed to love, but of their children. I'm sure you see this all the time, Heather, right? We're preaching to the choir.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm so glad our listeners are hearing this, right? So that if they are feeling this, experiencing this, just know you're not alone. And there's a lot, there is support out there for you, even with this, you know, industrial complex and the systems that we all have in whatever state you're in. Now, I would love it if Dr. C, you could provide us a basic definition of coercive control for our listeners.
Sure. So it's when one person or group of people exert power and control over another. And frankly, these people do not just show up behaving this way. This is a pattern of behavior for them, that they know how to engage victims in a process of gaining trust, of feeling loved. And that is the coercion, right? So how do I capitalize on your, we can call them strengths, but they're also vulnerabilities, on your kind heart, on your giving, on your conscientiousness. And then I'm going to use that in a way to erode away your autonomy, your agency, so that you begin to not really see clearly perhaps what's happening in this dynamic. And from there, that's when the psychological tactics of gaslighting and manipulation occur, intimidation and isolation. And sadly, what we know about coercive control is that very frequently, if not always, intensifies post-separation. And so the moment that the victim attempts to escape, the abuser, again, already having these character traits where they need to exert power and control over another. Some people call them narcissistic abusers. We call them coercive controller, narcissistic abusers in our book. That these people cannot handle the idea that someone is either exposing them for who they are, number
Right.
one, or number two, rejecting them, like saying, I'm done with this relationship. I'm ready to leave. I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to escape. And when that happens, abusers often intensify. They tighten their grip over the victim. So coercive control, as Dr. Evan Stark states, I worked under him for my doctoral program. What he states is it happens within the relationship and outside of it. It crosses time and space. It doesn't matter. These abusers know how to wield control, whether they're living with you or they're not living with you.
And let's talk about this because coercive control takes shape around the prevalence of male dominance and their superior positions related to women. And is that what you typically see?
Amy, do you want to take that one?
Yes, we do. And I think that even though we're not living in the 90s anymore, let's face it, a lot of women do stay home with their kids. I work with a lot of clients. Some are high net worth families here in Connecticut, or they're middle of the road where there is a lot of financial abuse. The women have no idea. I was just on with a woman this morning. She has no idea how much the mortgage is. She has no idea what bank accounts are open. She has no idea how much her husband makes. She just is told to sign the tax returns every year. So I think, that's what we see, whether we like it or not. Our society, rewards men, right? We have men who are in a power position. Often it can be reversed, but often he can be the breadwinner. The wife can take one for the team, and it's a joint decision to stay home. And that's where the power imbalance is. It seems like a great idea in the beginning. That's why I'm a huge proponent of women having prenups and post-nups if they decide to stay home. And, that protects you, right?
Yeah. And Dr. Stark did call it a gendered oppression. And that doesn't necessarily means that it happens from man to woman, although that is how it is prevalent, but that it is about one person thinking that as a result of who they are, they get to exert power and control over another person. We see this occurring in gay relationships, right? We see it occurring in relationships that people who don't identify along the binary, but it is about power imbalance. It's about, I get to have power over you.
And women are at far greater risk of victimization when compared to men when we're talking about this, right?
I mean, 35% of women suffer physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. I think I said this on the other episode. And if 35% of women are suffering physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, how many women, first of all, those are the reported cases.
Correct.
How many of those are unreported? How many are unreported? And then let's add in how many women have never been hit or slapped, me, and still suffered abuse and an eroding away of their autonomy, their agency. They didn't know who they were, even though I was a successful college professor and a therapist. I, in the home, had been eroded away. And then how many children are growing up in these family systems? It's a quite prevalent problem, and it's definitely a woman's issue for sure. And if we can help women, by the way, I always say to men, listen, if you have a sister or mother, and we talk about this in the book, right, Amy, right? If you have a sister or mother or a friend, it doesn't matter, any woman in your life who is suffering this, then if we can help those people, then from there we can begin to help. It's like from there you help the most vulnerable, and from there you can help the rest.
Exactly. And it's true. And well, let's just jump right in. Amy, because I would love our listeners to hear about these stories and the individuals, these women's personal stories about their experiences, because it's a bit shocking on some level, right? And there may be some disbelief, I'm sure, for many readers. But Amy, if you wanted to start and tell us who you would love to talk about.
I guess our first story is a woman named Kathy. I think that one of the reasons we wrote the book was to educate all women, young women as well, who are out there dating, or maybe you're divorced and you're out there dating again. And I think it speaks to a lot of our society's influence on our decisions when we choose a mate, and what we overlook sometimes, because, I'm just going to read you a little of the beginning of her story and then toward the end so you get a taste of it. She's from the United States, and she says, we met in the early 90s. I was a year out of college and he was a couple of years older. There was an immediate spark, even though I was not looking to date anybody. We really seemed to connect, continued to date, and we seemed to fall hard for each other. After a few months, Ian introduced me to his family and invited me to his sibling's wedding. Apparently, it was the first time he'd ever introduced a girlfriend to the family. So things went very quickly. They move in together, but it is a roller coaster ride, right? And we say in the book somewhere, roller coasters are only fun in amusement parks, not in relationships, right? Because as time went on, the marriage fell apart for various reasons. There was abuse that she chronicles, and she says, I've been divorced now for 8 years and into the 11th year of financial abuse, litigation abuse, emotional abuse, and more. What I've suffered at the hands of my ex, his attorney, and the family court is so mind-blowing that there are no words to express what I have experienced and watch others endure the same and even worse. I don't consider myself naive or stupid. I just didn't realize there could be someone posing as a human being who pretended to love me, who could be so evil and twisted. It's something I have come to understand is likely narcissistic personality disorder. Now gazing at the emperor with his clothes off, I see everything. And, she talks about the double standard in family court. He's living this lifestyles of the rich and famous life while he's not paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in support. And that's the abuser's playbook, to decimate you financially, emotionally, physically. So you're finally waving the white flag. Many of the women in our book are 5, even 10 years into a war like this. And I think we can say that till we're blue in the face, but hearing these women's stories in their own words, really, we hope the reader empathizes, and women can say, I was in a relationship like that. I miss those red flags, or maybe that's happening in the relationship I'm in, and I better think twice about this.
And like some of the things in her story that I think were brought up, like her friends and family noticed red flags, but were hesitant to intervene. And why do you think that is?
I think people kind of stay out of private relationships a lot, right? And I also think that we are conditioned as a society that, there's these Disney movies and these rom-coms. And I think that sometimes family members see only the outside. I think in her case, they did see a few things. But I think sometimes family members say, well, who am I to stop this wedding from happening, right? I could be wrong. He also took her on this amazing trip and did this for her and that for her. And so they kind of talk themselves out of it, much like the abuse victim themselves does, right? That's the cycle of abuse. They do something awful and then they do something great. And then you start bargaining with yourself. Well, he didn't mean it. He apologized, even though he shoved me. And right.
Right.
So I think the family members, unless they're trained in this field, often take a back seat because they also think that the victim probably won't believe them. They're so in love at that moment in the love bombing that they're not listening to other people.
And would you just kind of elaborate on the love bombing? Because I know what that is, but for our listeners, because it's a big part of this and goes, like in how you were saying, how the relationship moved really quickly.
I would say that it usually happens in the beginning of the relationship, though it can be used strategically, intermittently later. But it's the, showering with dinners and trips and material items and being the perfect person. And I often think that women think to themselves, well, this is how it is in the movies, right? Isn't it my turn to be treated this way? I finally met a great guy. Why am I doubting him? He loves me. He's doing all these great things for me. So it's kind of that honeymoon period, the courtship. And they do that to secure you, to lock you in. Either, you get pregnant, have a child, you get married, you move in with them, you move across the country for them. You're reacting to the love bombing so that they ultimately can get the control they want.
And let's talk a little bit about, and I know you both will have something to say because on this from, working with these women as well as all the stories, because, I think Kathy admitted only years later to herself that like the relationship was unhealthy. But why do you think that even if we know that it's not right, women just tend to stay in these relationships, much longer than you would think, right? Once they have the realization.
Sure. I mean, I want to go back to just something that I think is important for your listeners to know is that the Violence Against Women's Act was put into place in 1994. And the reality is prior to that time, any kind of violence in the home was perceived as a family matter. So you see, we have a world of belief systems already embedded that make it seem that if something happens behind closed doors and women are actually safer in an alley than they are in their own home. And so that's the world we live in. And in 1994, when we created that, we finally created an office on the study of women and in violence. We never before you cannot find an article on domestic abuse anywhere prior to 1994 because there was nobody funding those kinds of articles. I mean, I'm not suggesting there aren't any, but really there were hardly any. And that's the system that we've lived in this world where we think these are family matters. We don't want to get involved. And even this book, I took this book to an event recently, and I had an attorney come up to me and say, and it's a friend of mine, and she said, these stories, are they really? I mean, these must be your worst stories. And I was like, no. And I had another very dear colleague, a man, not young any longer, but when he was younger, he witnessed his mother's murder by his abuser. And he said the same thing to me. He asked specifically about a story in here and asked if we really knew that was the accurate relationship to the events that occurred. And so there is a disbelief. There is to the point, to answer your question, why do women stay? We disassociate from stuff that makes us uncomfortable. And frankly, the brain's idea of feeling good is when things feel good. The brain disassociates from the bad. And of course, trauma bonding and the neurological response that occurs, the abuser learns over time. See, they start off, as Amy was just describing, all of that wonderful stuff in the beginning, but then slowly over time, they only have to give a little bit of that in order to pull us back in. And that's the trauma bond. That's actually a neurological response in the brain. It's not just a word anymore. We know that there is, we can see it on scans. So if I'm an abuser, I was with someone 27 years and 11 months. That's not including the 7 years I dated that person. So why did I stay, even though I was teaching on it every single semester in my college social work classes? Because I would get this little drop of good and I would hold on to it.
Hold on to it.
We hold on to whatever we can, and we want to disassociate and add in that if you have children or a home that you don't want to lose, and in your head, it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. So I hope that answers the question, but I think it's very remarkable that we're at 2024, and in 1994 is when we first started researching this and seeing this as beyond a family incident issue.
I do. I think that's good to know, and it puts it in perspective, right? It hadn't been long that anyone's had any interest in the violence against women. So let's talk. Talk about another one of these brave women who shared their story.
Sure.
Who would you like to talk about?
Yeah. We should mention there's 22. So they're case studies is what they are. But for your listeners, just so you know, again, we have, a preface and a foreword, and we have introductions that explain a little bit about these dynamics. And then we have a call to action. And the book is, certainly filled with numerous references that validate the information in the stories so that your listeners and viewers here would say, oh my gosh, let me learn more about that. They could go to the reference list and actually get that research. So we tried to make it user friendly, and we are so grateful to these 22 protective mothers who were willing to share these stories with us. So just have to say that this story is, it's called Congrats, You Lost Custody. This is Charlotte's story. She's in the United States. So Charlotte, of course, fell in love. And then when she decided to divorce her abuser, the courts called it high conflict. Whenever we hear that word, we know that it means abuse. There is one person, and research shows us, that is drawn towards conflict. And victims and survivors may behave in ways that don't seem really good sometimes, but that's what happens after years, months, or days of being harmed over and over again. We really need court professionals to understand the difference between what an abuser's intent is when they misbehave and what a victim's intent is. And it's protection, self-defense. So she writes about, I'm just going to start right in the kind of center of it. So she files for divorce. It's called high conflict. He's an excessive drinker. And basically, additionally, the fact that DCS, the Child Welfare Agency, had closed the more than 24 investigations into the abuse of my children was enough for the judge to deem me as a vindictive ex-wife who would stop at nothing to keep the children from having a relationship with their father. This judge pointed out several times in his written decisions that he was thankful he had been able to observe my demeanor. This statement alone would make it difficult for his decision to be overturned on appeal. The judge further defended his conclusion by claiming I had somehow been able to convince every witness, including the court-appointed forensic psychologist, court-appointed child therapist, my children's pediatrician, 3 teachers, 2 school counselors, and a police officer to have a negative opinion of Mike. I was ordered to pay $50,000 of my ex's attorney fees. As a first grade teacher, I barely earned enough that much in an entire year, forcing me to file for bankruptcy. Since I had supposedly done so many egregious things, for example, attempted to protect my children from their abusive father and his abusive family members, I needed to be punished. The judge remanded me to spend 6 days in jail at the height of COVID for withholding my children from their father. Finally, the worst of this was that I was not allowed to have any contact with my children for 5 weeks. I was devastated. There was no way to know if my children were okay. They were living with the abuser. And of course, there was no way to prevent the abuse from occurring. My attorney filed an appeal, but as expected, the appeals court completely agreed with the trial court's findings. The case was all over the internet, and the oral arguments were published on YouTube. You can look it up. I even received a bright yellow "Congratulations, you did it" award from a large law practice 4 hours away for losing custody and decision making. They posted it on their website. These children were being sexually abused by their father and their grandfather. And she had all of this evidence, and this is how she was treated. She did finally regain custody of the children, thankfully.
That's it is shocking, especially when you hear, and that's the thing. The judges have a lot of power. They do. They have the power to put you in jail. And it's just shocking. Thank goodness in the end she prevailed, but of course not without certainly continual more damage to her children.
I think that's the key, right? Is that for some reason there seems to be this worry about having a bias to protect children. Why is there a problem with having a bias to protect children, to look out for their best interests? How is that something that's problematic? And we see this. Amy and I have talked about this, this idea that it's career suicide if you say, oh, I like that court professional I was mentioning earlier who says, I never allow for no contact. Like he's going to force this 16-year-old to see his father. Like, why? It's quite unbelievable.
It is. And I think many times, just like you said, now, like I'm, racking my brain thinking of things in the past, that they say, well, the judge isn't going to do that. So I'm going to recommend what he's probably or she's going to do, because then I'll have more of this work rather than if I, actually act on the evidence, which they don't say that. I'm adding that part.
Yeah.
I think that's what's going on, and it's just unfortunate. But also, this idea has been going on for some time, and you two probably have an idea of the origin of this, but that if the mother is protecting her children or believes that, what he's done to me is going to do to them, it all of a sudden becomes alienation. And that word, that definition gets applied. And then now you're on the defensive when you were really on the offense, trying to say, no, these are all the things he's doing, and trying to protect, like you said, the protective parent. And now they totally reverse it with that one word, which is everybody in the world or in the family court system is so worried that we're keeping fathers from their children. Right? This is like the biggest worry, right? The guy comes in, says, oh, I want this and that. You're Superman. We think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And it's like, what, you've never done that before. And now all of a sudden they think you're a hero. And then anything we do as a woman is wrong. And I think that just goes back to our society. Like you said, it's just been for so long ingrained. It's really hard to overcome that.
Yeah. I think that we have a deep-seated misogyny in our justice system. It's something I've written about for Ms. Magazine. I didn't mention that I'm a journalist who writes about these issues and tries to shine a light on them. And we talk in the book about the term himpathy, right, which was, coined by an Australian philosopher, Kate Mann, because that's what we see is there is an inordinate amount of sympathy given to the men. And I remember when I first researched, how did we end up here? Right. And we used to go by the tender years doctrine, right, where it was widely seen as, whoever was with the children the most should have most custody. It was often the mother. And we've transitioned the past few decades due to the men's rights movement to best interests of the child. But as we know, best interest of the child is used to justify, time with both parents, no matter what, even if one parent is an abuser. And we often say that, yeah, if any guy goes into court and shows any interest in having his children, the court seems to glorify him as an amazing dad. I've had cases with clients where they say, oh, well, he hit the mom, but he hasn't done anything to the kids. So, I mean, they're okay. He gets half custody or even more.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, but it's still very much like that. And yeah, and now court personnel will tell a mother with a newborn, right? So under 6 months, an infant, you can just pump. I mean, that generally the medical community doesn't necessarily think that's the greatest thing. However, not that they'll come in defense of women and mothers, but yeah. So like you were saying, like you were saying, the tender years for our listeners used to be, babies, toddlers, like need their mom. And we all know that. And now, I mean, they will send a week-old baby to the father and from the mom, and that baby needs to go back and forth. It's really become insane.
We have like a little bit of information in one of our stories, because this is part of the problem, is that physicians and school personnel and therapists are often afraid to get engaged in this process. I mean, nobody wants to be dragged into court. So what do? I have one of our stories is a woman who was accused of child medical neglect, what we know as Munchausen by proxy, right? And because up until the time before she filed for divorce, the abuser totally believed the child had this concerning problem that the doctors were addressing, some of the best doctors in the country were addressing. She filed for divorce, and he basically flipped all of the care of the child and said the child did not have this issue, and started calling the mother basically medically abusing her child. In other words, making it up. And so these wonderful doctors who had supported her up until that point, supported both parents, they both were in agreement, now all of a sudden were absent. Yeah, there's a discomfort with coming forward and speaking out about what is actually just and right. And that's an integrity issue. Like, these conversations really, aren't they, around ethics and integrity and the lack of it in the systems?
Yeah. We have time for one more story. So I'd love to either one of you to pick your favorite one. If Amy, you have another one, or case study.
My hair are cute little puppies.
I apologize. Those are mine. And they're just loud too. Little and loud.
All right. This is Michelle's story. She's also from the United States, and her chapter is called The Abuser's Playbook. And she says, my name is Michelle and I want a divorce. These are the very words that initiated my living hell. 3 years ago, I was free of debt, naive and trusting. Now, with over $300,000 in legal fees and deep and personal debt, I am acutely aware of what can happen in divorce. Let me make something clear. You don't have free will in these coercively controlling narcissistic relationships. You are being controlled and dominated by someone in all aspects of your life, and it's by someone who's telling you they love you. It's coercive control. The confusion they create is powerful. She goes on to say that her husband was the safe option, she thought, in her life, but there was domestic abuse. He even locked her in a room, and police came and actually arrested her. And, this woman is a high-powered executive. You would never think this could happen to someone like her, but we have many women who have been arrested. She goes on to say litigation tactics by Jeremy and his counsel have cost me immensely in legal fees and time away from work. These are bullying tactics that harm me and my children. They don't participate in good faith settlement negotiations. We attempted mediation, but he refused to negotiate basic terms of a divorce. He had a list of extreme demands for money and assets, but would not negotiate. So they're 2 years into the process. All of these court professionals are drawn in. I love her ending, because she says, this is just a game to abusers, but this is my life. This is our lives and our children's lives. We must change the rules and create consequences. My last message for women is this one. You have to leave. This is not an option. You have to leave for your sanity to survive. Because we know that some women will read these stories and say, oh my gosh, I don't want this to happen to me.
Right.
Can I
don't want to
leave? But the reality is, if you stay, it's not going to get better. We know it's going to get worse. And I think that, Michelle testified in her state anonymously and helped get legislation passed So these women feel so strongly, like we do, about paying it forward, using their stories to help the women who might be entering into the system right now, like a babe in the woods, like I was.
Right. And, let's talk a little bit for our listeners, because I know in Michelle's story as well, it was the talk of the weaponizing the guardians ad litem and, how that happens. I'd love for you to touch on that for our listeners, just so they can get that perspective.
Well, I think Dr. C and I would agree that often when the GAL is involved, it does not go well. It's very rare that you hear of a good instance. It sounds like a great thing. And if you don't know any better, you think, okay, an attorney for the child, they're going to represent them. They're going to be neutral in this case. I'm sure they're going to see the truth here. Not always the case. They succumb to that empathy, to that misogyny. It's so sad that often we see that women are harder on other women than even men are. So when a GAL is involved, things get more expensive, more contentious. The abuser often uses parental alienation as part of their playbook and their accusation. And there are other parts of the playbook they use as well. But all of these court professionals are drawn in, which of course is exhausting the woman financially. Also,
right.
She's got to come up with all this money just to possibly see her children or get custody of her children. So they know that our children are our Achilles heel as moms, as parents.
Yeah.
And they use it to their advantage.
Now, Michelle also has an interesting point of the shocking reality is that many women just don't have the right to get divorced. And I would love for y'all to weigh on that too.
I have a lot to say on that. And she says in her chapter that, we've got to change divorce in our country and in all countries, really, because right now abusers are able to weaponize the system and have the upper hand, because once you're into this divorce industrial complex, we talked about, you're kind of stuck and they can drag it out. Delay is one of their tactics, ex parte motions, vexatious litigation, all of these things, driving up attorneys' fees. And Michelle suggests that, we should have a time limit. If you haven't decided by a certain time, the judge decides. I think it's scary where we're headed in our country, where some states have suggested getting rid of no-fault divorce. It's something I've written about for Ms. Main and HuffPost, because we know this will trap domestic abuse victims in particular in marriages. It's already hard to get out. All evidenced here. If you're going to say that a victim has another hoop to jump through and prove first she has a right to get married, then she has to prove everything else to get what she deserves financially or to get custody of her children, women will become enslaved in these marriages.
Which, by the way, I think it's important to so when I think about coercive control contextually, it crosses all spheres. So what's really happening and what the shifts that Amy's talking about, especially with this no-fault divorce changes, is it's coercive control by the system.
Yeah.
And when we think about it, it's about individuals or groups of individuals exerting power and control over another or others. It certainly feels as women in society in general that there are always these powers above us exerting power and control over us. And then now we kind of have this opportunity, frankly, if I'm a person who is an abuser, to have carte blanche. And it's really very frightening. And I would like to just go back to what you said about alienation, because I think it's important for, your listeners to hear this, that women are disbelieved for their own abuse. We talk about this in the book at a rate of 55% in the family court system. So some of the coaching that Amy does, and I know I do also with custody situations with clients, sometimes get out of the court system as quickly as you can, because the court system, and by the way, talking about your abuse may not help your case. It could make your case worse. And so navigating that very carefully, because it's not all situations, but knowing that this is a pattern that continues to happen in our family court system. In addition to that, if a mother discloses that her children have been physically abused, she's disbelieved at a rate of about 77%. And if she discloses that her children have been sexually abused, she's disbelieved at a rate of 85%. And the last 21 days, I have had 7 mothers that I am working with who have disclosed sexual abuse, 4 of them have lost custody. 4 have lost custody by disclosing that they believe their children, and several UTIs. We're not talking just, I'm saying this is occurring. We are talking about evidence, and that the judges are flipping custody over to the perpetrator. If I'm a child perpetrator, and I always say this, and my work began with child sexual abuse, not all coercive controllers are pedophiles, but all pedophiles are using the same exact grooming techniques as an adult coercive controller in an intimate relationship. We have a crisis on our hands. This is a crisis, and people want to keep looking through their rose-colored glasses. It is time to flip the glass upside down. I'm sorry. It's been a rough 21 days. Let me just tell you that. These stories are absolutely heartbreaking.
I hear you. Well, and I don't know what does the future look like? What do we hope to see in the next 5 years? And what do you think we will see within this space and coercive control?
God.
I know.
It's a rough time. We're in a rough
not
patch
super
right
hopeful.
now.
Yeah. So
5 years?
well, I
was going to say, I think that we hope that everyone becomes as impassioned as Dr. C and I are about this, right? That they read the book. Our goal is that they're pissed off by the end of the book, that how could this be happening? How could abusers be getting custody of these child victims, when women are just trying to protect their children? I think most of America in the world has no idea this is going on. And we hope by the time they get to the end of the book, and look, we say it's not a beach read, but it's a must read. But by the time you get to the call to action, you're ready to roll up your sleeves, because there are things you can do in your states. We have Caden's law that was passed on a national level, and it needs to be passed in every state. And it does 3 good things, right? It restricts expert testimony to those qualified. It limits the use of reunification camps and therapies, which we haven't even talked about, that force victims with the abusive parent. And it also requires that you provide evidence-based trainings to judges and court personnel on coercive control, like what Dr. C does all the time. A lot of these things happen on the state level. The National Safe Parents Organization is a great one people can join. There are state chapters where you can figure out who in my state is working toward this, right?
Right.
How can I show up? How can I push legislation? Here in Connecticut, we just had a bunch of legislation proposed thanks to grassroots efforts.
And there are some class action lawsuits that are in the works. We are hearing over and over again of victims coming together. I think part of the issue is that there's a lot of fragmentation in information, and it's like there's not one coalition. There's lots of different people doing this work, and it's great that there's a lot of different, but I think, we need a united front, and these class action lawsuits are the beginning of that kind of thing happening, hopefully, where women are coming together and saying, that's it. We need to get rid of judges that keep making egregious decisions. I don't know, there is the robing room. If your listeners are not aware of the robing room, which is where you can rate your judge. And frankly, I have a client who went on there and found out her judge is absolutely horrifying, and finding the information. This is the point, right? Sometimes knowing something is really challenging and overwhelming, but knowing is better than not knowing. Having the information. That's why we wrote the book. We want people to know how to protect themselves. Give this book to your daughter. Give this book to your niece, so that they know that when they end up in these relationships in the beginning, it's not going to look like it's going to be abusive. It doesn't look like that at the beginning. It gets to that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I appreciate that. But before we go, which I can't, the time went so quickly. There's just so much to say about this topic, but I'd like it if each of you could impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience. You want to go first, Amy?
Sure. I think that we say all the time that protective mothers are the strongest women we know. What they go through, and when you read these stories, I think it will inspire every woman, whether they're going through a divorce, a hard relationship, or just a challenge in life. I think that it's incredible, their resilience and what we'll do for our children. I think when we talked about the breaking point, when someone leaves a relationship like this, I've seen moms go without just about everything you can think about, and money, sleeping on the couch, giving up so many things. But when something happens to their child, that is the switch that flips for them, and they must leave the relationship. They must report the abuse. And I think they are role models for all of us. And as Dr. C said, we are incredibly grateful that they were brave enough and trusted us to share their stories in our book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say, again, the strongest people on the planet. I mean, there's no greater grief than parenting a child who is suffering unacknowledged child abuse and sending them off to time with an abuser.
Yeah.
But protective parents need to recognize that they have so much influence. I mean, I'm a therapist, and I think that protective parents are better therapists if they understand how coercive control is inflicted, that they can be the best influence for their children, even if they're only seeing them for a short period of time every week. And I believe it's so important to empower them and understanding. Any of your listeners, if this is you, you have to understand that your little snippet of time or your great snippet of time with your children can be the difference between them being able to get through this horrific abuse and not getting through it. You have so much influence, and I want them to know that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. So quickly, before we're done, I would love it if Dr. C and Amy, you could let our listeners know where they can find you for more information and resources.
Sure. My website is freedomwarrior.info. I do free 15-minute coaching consultations, and I have other free resources on my website. On Instagram, I'm at Freedom Warrior.
Awesome. And Dr.
Yeah, so I'm at Coercive Control Consulting, and Instagram, Dr. Cocchiola _coercive control. I have I'm always having lots of freebies and trying to be supportive of protective parents who are navigating parenting children who have been harmed by an abuser. So if this is you, if you have a child who is going between homes, doesn't want to go, or is aligning with the abuser, whatever it is, that this is my particular favorite thing to help people.
Wonderful. Well, we've reached the end of our show today. Thank you so much, Christine Cocchiola and Amy Polacko, for joining us to discuss their work in coercive control, their book, Framed, in the urgent realities women face in the family court system. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Listeners, if you or someone you know in the Northeast Florida area is going through or even thinking about divorce, you're not alone. Taking that first step can feel overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. Our newsletter is filled with actionable advice tailored to guide you through this process. By signing up, you'll gain the tools to face the unknown with courage and see if we're the right fit to support you during this life-changing time. Don't wait. Click the link in the show notes, fill out the form, and take the first step toward building a brighter future today.